Hello, everyone. We'll be starting the presentation shortly. We're going to give it a few minutes for all other registrants to join. Thank you for your patience. Welcome, everyone. First off, thank you all for taking the time to attend this live webcast. My name is Vipin Shri. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager here at Rapid Ratings. We're so glad to see everyone here and a lot of recurring attendees from last time, so that's always reassuring for us. Just a few logistical items. The webinar will be recorded and sent out shortly after the session. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, but please ask your questions in the available function on your GoToWebinar portal. If you're having any issues, please email me directly at vipin.shri@rapidratings.com. With that said, it's with great pleasure that I introduce you to our two speakers today, Bindya Vakil and James Gellert. Bindya is CEO and co-founder of Resilinc, a supply chain mapping and monitoring firm that's recently been featured in Harvard Business Review, Bloomberg TV, and NPR. She is an avid motorcyclist. James is the CEO and co-founder of Rapid Ratings. He has a vast array of financial and supply chain experience. He prefers his whiskey to be Irish or from Kentucky. James, take it away.
Thank you, Vipin. It's a great introduction, and I'm glad you're focusing on both Bindya's and my strengths. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Appreciate it. Also, very much appreciate the opportunity to present this webinar with Bindya. Resilinc is a great partner of ours, and Bindya is one of the foremost experts in supply chain. So the opportunity to speak and talk about our common views of what's happening in the market and how people can best manage risk in their supply chains, particularly at this time, is very valuable. So thank you, Bindya, for joining me. Let me start by just explaining briefly what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about financial health and why financial health is important in supply chain risk. We're going to touch on the impact of COVID, recognizing that COVID is not the reason for understanding financial health or the financial risk in a supply chain, but it certainly presents an environment where financial health and risk is of greater importance perhaps than it has ever been in the past. And we're going to hear from Bindya about strategies and tools for monitoring and mitigating risk in supply chains and how the Rapid Ratings data is integrated into Resilinc and available there to be able to use financial health in conjunction with the excellent tools that Resilinc has. And then we will add a handful of parting thoughts and insights from our common clients, of which there are many. Bindya, may I ask you to touch on this slide for a moment?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on this session, and thank you all for spending your time listening to this webinar. This is a time of great uncertainty. We're going through unprecedented challenges. Many of us, whether it's us or directly, some of our colleagues or loved ones are perhaps affected personally, or one of our loved ones might be affected, either health related, financial hardship, etc. It's really a time that we come together, empathize, be there for each other, and tackle whatever challenges we are facing together. So on behalf of everyone here at Resilinc, as well as our partners at Rapid Ratings, I want to wish all of you the very best of luck. May we all meet adversity with our collective strengths, talent, and creativity, and come out better, stronger, more resilient on the other side. James?
Thank you, Bindi. I can't possibly add to that. That was excellent, and I appreciate it. Let me talk about financial health for a moment and explain that financial health is a common factor across all companies that we work with, either that we sell to or that we buy from. On the call today, I know we have members of both corporate institutions, non-financial and financial institutions. So we'll talk about suppliers, even though suppliers as a broad category certainly includes vendors and other types of third parties that banks monitor for third-party risk. So know that all of our comments are applicable to both categories. But financial health of suppliers is something that has been looked at periodically with different intensity by corporations and banks over time. And particularly for the last 10 years, there's been a lot of evaluating of multiple risk control areas, cyber being one of the most prevalent, but other areas like CSR and governance risk, traditional compliance aspects, health and safety, regulatory, and a wide variety of others. And in the COVID environment, these issues, particularly financial, have become more amplified and highlighted as opposed to being created by COVID. It's important to recognize that financial risk is something that is actually foundational to all of these others. And companies that are strong and strengthening financially have greater resources and wherewithal to be able to invest in these other risk control areas. And companies that are weakening in financial health are less positioned, or they are in a worse position to be able to invest fresh capital or to be able to continue to invest if they have been in some of these areas. So there's a direct correlation between risks appearing in these other risk areas and financial risk, with financial being a leading indicator. It's one of the reasons that it is one of the most foundational and important areas to have organized into workflows within your organizations to be able to understand, both for short-term and for long-term purposes. When we talk about financial health, we talk about understanding both that longer-term and the shorter-term elements within a supplier. We call our core health score is the 2 to 3 year forward-looking evaluation of a company and how resilient it is relative to its global peers, how efficiently it's run, how well it's able to generate returns based on a multitude of factors and so forth. Whereas the financial health rating is a 1 year perspective that looks at the resiliency, including factors like liquidity and leveraging and earnings performance. So one modifies the other. Resilience is a shorter term factor, understanding the longer term strengths or weaknesses of a business. And it's important to be able to understand both of these for mitigating downside risk and avoiding troubled areas within a company, but also being able to align with the stronger companies to create a more resilient supply chain. And it's really about understanding the strengths and the weaknesses well enough and early enough to make informed and substantiated business decisions of short and long-term natures. But using financials and having the primary source financials, the actual financials for private companies and the reported financials for public companies, is imperative because it is really the only way to be able to understand the actual financial strength of a company. And this can be a critical and valuable part of creating supplier transparency and collaboration, which ultimately leads to better relationships. Even when there's weakness in a supplier, being able to talk about their weaknesses and ways of working with them more closely to help them positively affect those weaknesses is a critical part of supplier relationship management, of which financial transparency is a critical part. I want to mention that as we talk about financial risk in tier 1 and sub-tiers of supply chain, and we talk about COVID and the impact of it, it's important to recognize the context that actually over the last 4 years, there has been a decline in financial health globally. We have seen a reduction in financial health ratings of companies across the 140 countries that we rate companies in, but in the 30 that we rate the largest critical mass of ratings, the biggest economies and some of the emerging market economies as well, we have seen 29 of 30 of them decreasing as recently as last year, where almost 30% of companies had declining revenue in 2019. So this becomes extremely important in recognizing that the early indicators of risk are only being exacerbated by the stresses that the COVID crisis is presenting. And this becomes even more important as questions about reshoring or diversifying offshore strategies and sub-tier visibility gain greater and greater prominence because of the crisis. Bindya, may I ask you to touch on this, please?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting time. As we said, companies are facing unprecedented challenges. In certain sectors, we see demand has been wiped out. And yeah, it's slowly coming back, but we're nowhere close to where we were in January or February. So, when you look at your suppliers, there are small and medium companies there are thousands of small and medium businesses that feed some of your mid-tier suppliers who you may consider a direct supplier that is very strong and financially robust. The idea here is that supply chain is basically an ecosystem that has a lot of interdependencies from smaller companies that feed the larger companies. Now, the challenge in this environment is that many of those second-tier suppliers or third-tier suppliers that may be smaller companies that are supporting some companies around that ecosystem may be at risk. They may be under financial distress. They may not be able to secure debt or equity type financing in order to give them sufficient cash to continue through the next few months and stay afloat. So I think it's really important when you look at the numbers. For example, this was a few months ago, Bloomberg reported it out of small businesses in China. The question was asked, how many months of cash do you have on hand? And overwhelmingly, 75% of companies had less than 3 months of cash on hand. So as you can imagine, obviously there are certain things companies can do, such as cut expenses. They can do broader layoffs and things like that, try to make the cash run as long as possible. But we're really now at that point where, and we've already seen record bankruptcies and financial distress happen already. But that activity, especially now with COVID sort of making almost a comeback or refusing to go out, and many states or countries relooking at how do we now continue lockdown or restrictions. I think this creates further tension in that ecosystem that may create certain of these companies that weren't as strong and didn't have the wherewithal and the long-term cash to go into financial distress. So really important in this time to keep an eye not only on your direct companies that you have long-term relationships with, but really identify who are the suppliers that feed these large companies, where are they located, how are their financials, and what is their financial strength as well.
And when you think about the financial strength of these companies and data like this, what's relevant to understand is that there are pre-existing conditions in companies like their liquidity profile that are identifiable if you're looking at the financials and you're analyzing them right, or you're asking the right questions. But if you are relying on if you're not doing financial assessment, or you're relying on things like payment scores that don't look at don't do a deep dive on the actual financials of a company, there's a lot that can be missed. And with a reported 460,000 private companies in China going out of business alone in the first quarter, one must ask, could you have known that? And were there pre-existing conditions or signals and signs that could be identified? In the upper right of this upper right graph here, you see an interesting difference between private companies in China going into this year relative to their global peers. And this is just one measure, looking at short-term debt to their total debt, essentially how much debt during the 1 year period going forward is due in that year. And what you see here is that the Chinese companies had close to an 83% ratio of short-term debt to total debt, relative to the high 20s for their global peer group and about 24% for US private companies. What this means is there was more pressure on those companies to have to refinance their debt in this calendar year, which of course, in a time of great turbulence, volatility, and credit contraction, particularly from banks around the world, this puts significantly greater pressure on this group. It was an identifiable factor, and those who had mitigated risk of private company suppliers in China or were at least aware of this were better positioned than others. Similarly, you see here in the bottom that global private companies had less than a third of them had less than 2 weeks worth of inventory to be able to deliver on. So shutdowns were going to be extremely impactful, and obviously the shutdowns are much longer than probably anyone expected them to be, and are continuing. Along that theme of pre-existing conditions, good companies don't just fail. Weak companies have weakened over some period of time or from some absolutely extraordinary shock. So when you look at just a handful across a representative group of industries here, you look at a handful of companies that have filed for bankruptcy this year, you can see in their financial health ratings that there have been either declines year over year, or there has been volatility and then declines leading into the year of bankruptcy. One particular point to note here is that Hertz Global filed for bankruptcy with an FHR, financial health rating, in the low 40s, and 93% of companies historically have failed at 40 and below. We are starting to see a handful of companies, particularly in industries like transportation, that see the writing on the wall and are not extending and burning the last cash that they've got, but filing for bankruptcy earlier and more proactively, continuing the message that understanding these companies and understanding suppliers over a long period of time, being able to understand the trajectory of their financial health, is extremely important because the COVID crisis is having that impact as well. Now, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the second of 2 COVID-related stress tests that we've done. At RapidRatings, we looked at about 40,000 public and private companies globally. This is the second time that we have done this kind of testing. And we used industry-specific adjustments to revenue based on a variety of factors, including analyst estimates. And of course, industries like transportation and oil and gas and retail are ones that had the biggest expected 2020 hits to revenue, and then corresponding adjustments through their income statement and balance sheet that then presented with new ratings and stress tested ratings. And this shows you both the revenue change in gray, and in red, we're showing you what the average FHR change has been. And it is a significant deterioration in ratings based on these stress tests. To that end, there's approximately a 25% decrease in financial health ratings and approximately a 30% decrease in core health scores of these 40,000 public and private companies. And you see a halving of companies in our lower risk categories and over a doubling of companies ending up in our higher risk categories. Now, it's important to note that this is not prophetic. This does not mean that all companies are going to change this way. As Bindi has already indicated, a lot of companies are looking for ways of cutting costs and adjusting their businesses to adapt to the crisis. And so many will do better than this, but many are going to end up with this kind of a significant impact. And again, the important factor is being able to identify where those risks are in your supply chain. So we've taken a pre-stress test and post-stress test look at the majority of the companies that we rate in supply chains around the world. And you can see that in the prior, in the scatter chart, the pre-stress test ratings are in the quadrant to the upper right, which is basically the lower risk areas for both the core health score and the financial health rating on the two axes. When you stress test that portfolio, you see a close to 30% increase in the companies landing in high risk and very high risk. And you see a significant deterioration of the companies that are in that safer zone, being the low risk and very low risk. Some of the characteristics to point out are that public companies and private companies change differently. So the financial health rating pre-stress test of public companies for the average was a 59, whereas for private companies was a 62. And on a 100-point scale, these are relatively similar ratings. Under stress, the public companies drop to a 47 and the private companies to a 42, with a difference of 8 points, meaning the public companies only changed by 12 points and the private companies changed by 20 points. The reason for this is that private companies generally have less leverage, they generally have smaller balance sheets, and typically they're going to be more adversely affected by heavy impacts to their revenue and their cost structure as well, and obviously then correspondingly their profitability, but their balance sheets are going to have less resilience to an increased debt load, which is what most companies are having to do to get through the crisis. When we look at two portfolios within this aggregated group that started quite similarly, Portfolio A at a 68 and Portfolio B at a 66, drop post-shock to 44 and 52, 24-point decrease in Portfolio A and a 14-point decrease in Portfolio B. And the significant difference between them is that Portfolio A has a higher percentage of private companies that we have rated than Portfolio B. Portfolio B being a newer client and one that is ramping up their program. So we've yet to rate with them the majority of the private company critical suppliers they've got. What this suggests is that the companies that have greater visibility into the private companies in their supply chain will have more understanding of the actual risks that they are incurring because of COVID or simulated stress test for COVID. Whereas the company that is seeing the private companies in their supply chain less has less visibility and may have a mistaken view that they are carrying less risk because of COVID than indeed they actually are. Now, one final comment I wanted to make on financial health as it pertains to the COVID crisis, that we are all aware that companies have scrambled to adjust to this period. One of the significant things they have done is to borrow more money. And there's been plenty of press about how companies have drawn down bank lines and hit their revolvers and created as much liquidity as they possibly can. This shows a sampling of critical industries that everyone knows has been highly impacted by COVID. And you can see retail, we've broken out between retail US and retail international, but leisure, oil and gas, at least the producers, and transportation. And then we've highlighted a handful of the critical ratios that are important for demonstrating this trend. So what this is saying is that the actual ratings and the actual financial filings for companies in Q1, right, or done right after the Q1 filings, showed that in the retail industry in the US, there was a 133% increase in companies' cash to current liabilities, and their leverage increased by 24%, while profitability to revenue decreased by 10%, operating profit to total interest cost dropped by 25%, et cetera. The message here is that companies are levering themselves up by getting as much liquidity as they can, even at a time when their ability to service that debt is reducing because they are being impacted both from a revenue perspective and from a profitability perspective. Interesting, and the reason we broke out US and international on retail is to see internationally, COVID impacted companies outside the US earlier than they did in the US, and the US had more opportunity to see the impact that was occurring around the world, and therefore had more lead time to be able to act. So more of the US retailers were able to draw down facilities and ultimately issue more debt towards the end of March to be able to get more cash on hand, whereas the international retailers were not able to do that. And then, of course, in some of these industries, like in oil and gas, there's massive impact to both the top line and the bottom line. You're going to see when Q2 numbers come out, which they've just started to do, you're going to see significant exacerbation to all of these figures, and of course, significant impact to financial health ratings that are already starting to mirror the stress tested results that we produced a few weeks back. Bindia, let me pass it over to you.
Yeah, so I think the key thing here, as James mentioned, with all of what the stress test and all of these numbers are reflecting in the actual tracking of the bankruptcy filings as well, is we're seeing almost back to 2010 level bankruptcies for this year, right? So this is a very, very active year for Chapter 11 filings. Unsurprising, but it's always interesting when the data kind of shows what you expect to happen. In this case, unfortunately, we are dealing with this scenario. So our focus from this point forward is, okay, so this is the environment we're dealt. These are the cards we're dealt. As supply chain experts, how do we now deal with this? Like, what do we do about it? We have hundreds of suppliers. In some industries, we may be dealing with thousands of suppliers. So if we go to the next slide, the way Resilinc helps our customers work within this framework is segmenting the suppliers, right? Based on which suppliers do we closely manage. It's generally higher spend suppliers. Generally, the high spend suppliers tend to be publicly traded companies. And as James just mentioned, publicly traded companies have a lot more scrutiny. There's more information, more avenues for funding and things like that available. It's the privately held companies where we have the most surprises. And when we look at all of our customers, and we're looking at industries that you would find have suppliers that are difficult to generally replace. And so here in these industries like high-tech industries, semiconductor, pharma, life science, automotive, heavy machinery, aerospace, defense type of industries, when you are reliant on a very large set of privately held smaller companies as your suppliers, keeping track of these suppliers and ongoing monitoring them for any news that might create a potential for them to go into financial distress is really important. So one of the things, there are really 3 to 4 things that our customers do in this space. One is monitor news, and the news can be, there's a broader market news, but there's also things like force majeure, profit warnings, layoffs, CEO change, business sales, spin-off. These types of strategic movements, divestitures, etc., generally signal that there's something going on in the background within that supplier. And so monitoring is basically a must-have in today's environment. Keeping an eye on 100% of your suppliers through monitoring using AI and machine learning is very cost-effective in today's world, and therefore is a minimum thing that you need to be doing with your suppliers. The second thing is segmenting and knowing which of your suppliers are privately held versus publicly traded, and then making sure you're monitoring their financial health ratings with sources like what you get from RapidRatings. In fact, RapidRatings has some of the most robust private company financial health ratings out there because it's based on a very rigorous process that they follow, getting data directly with this, working with the suppliers. And then for your most strategic critical suppliers, and I'll talk about how you define those in the next slide, you have to have a direct relationship, meeting their CEO, CFO, or their sales leaders, and having a candid and transparent conversation about where are sales going, what does demand look like, how are their top 10 to 15 customers doing in terms of their own demand and health, right? So creating that assessment, which you see in the table on the right-hand side, is really important, where you look at the supplier spend, revenue impact, their difficulty of resourcing, and their financial health score, and put those suppliers in this type of a 2x2, where you say, okay, here are my suppliers that have the highest revenue impact, that are also very difficult to replace. Now, what do we mean by revenue impact? What we're saying is look at the supplier and see which of your products rely on the parts you buy from the supplier that you could not ship if the supplier or the associated parts were not available. So now that tells you that the suppliers are highest revenue impact to you as a business. So for those suppliers that are also high revenue impact and highest difficulty to resource, you want to take an active interest in those. These are your red zone suppliers, and meeting the CEO, CFO, and sales leadership, super critical. And here are some of the strategies our customers pursue that we really recommend. Now, if you look at your high spend suppliers, a lot of times it may be possible to order future demand today, give them the ability to borrow against the receivables, and obviously, this is I will preface my next comments by saying, you have to have an emergency fund, you have to be cash flow resilient yourself, and you have to have the cash to support and prop up your suppliers. And when you have those, that resilience on your side, then these are options that you can certainly pursue. And why do that? It's because you're trying to survive and thrive in the long term. This is a blip on your radar. And so you need to kind of make sure that your suppliers, your ecosystem does not get disrupted. And as I see on the x-axis, the cost, time, and effort of second sourcing or replacing a supplier, if it is high, then it is absolutely worth your time and effort to go requisition with your leadership and get your supplier the ability to stay afloat through the next few months. And these are some strategies for you to do that. As a no-brainer, most of our customers went and immediately relaxed payment terms. So over the last 2-3 years, many companies went to 60 or in some cases 90, and we saw some companies really asking for 180-day payment terms. That's a quick fix, where you can easily relax relaxed payment terms, pay on invoice, or pay, in some customers even started to pay upfront or pay on delivery. So depending on their ability to support their suppliers, different companies went with these options. Other companies also did things like look at ordering future demand now and helping the supplier borrow against. And then in some cases, now is actually a really good time with the stock market. Well, at least it was the last couple of weeks ago, where valuations may be very favorable. So if there's a critical second-tier supplier or direct supplier, now's a good time to go take a minority stake, do an M&A, or look at those types of strategic options if there's a supplier who may be struggling or needs some help. And then some other low spend supplier strategies that can really help your smaller suppliers are things like loan some cash, donate. Certainly for certain suppliers, that can be, if that's an option. In very interesting, two things that we saw happening is companies who had done supply chain mapping, they went and consolidated demand for certain expensive raw materials, went direct to the second tier, purchased those in bulk, and then gave it to the supplier, resold it or consigned it to the supplier either free or at a discount. Right? So these were some really good ways, because the supplier themselves, being in financial distress, may not have the credit worthiness to go secure raw materials with their supplier. The customer stepped in, helped them out. And then the small one, another one is relaxed SLAs. Sometimes we have very strict SLAs. Obviously, we don't want suddenly to relax child labor type of SLAs, or the things that are compliance or security or safety related. But just look at the things, and these are things that you come up with as solutions when you have that dialogue, open dialogue with the supplier. One thing I will say, and this is really important, when you meet the strategic leaders, the leadership team, and have these strategic and very candid and transparent conversations, one thing that should never happen is you use this information that the supplier shares to design the supplier out. So transparency should always be rewarded. Transparency should never be punished. And it always is. And when I was at Cisco, we lived through the 2008 crisis, bankruptcy, supplier distress, and all of that. One of the things that I really loved about working at Cisco is we work with our suppliers, help them solve problems. Many of the strategies that you see here, I personally saw us implement in that program, working with our suppliers. And over the years, it helped us build very strong partnerships with those suppliers. We had helped those suppliers stay afloat through the most difficult times. And when times were good, suppliers reciprocated with better terms, more allocation when constraints happen, in some cases deeper discounts to us compared to others. So what goes around comes around. Let's use this time to work together and kind of help the supplier to protect our own future as well. James, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, Bindya, I think it's great that you just went through all of those options, and I would stress that when you understand the financial health of a supplier, it is much easier to have a conversation with them about these options. For instance, just the simple one of extending payment terms. There may be some suppliers where extending payment terms is completely viable based on the strength that they have, and you may offer something in return for that flexibility. But there may be companies in your supply chain that extending payment terms will actually put them over the edge because they are so weak. But if you don't have that visibility, combined with the dialogue with the management of the companies, you're acting arbitrarily in ways that could very negatively affect certain suppliers and be incidental to others. The other piece I would mention is that we did a survey that we put out to 18,000 global private companies, and one of the consistent comments that we got from respondents was that visibility into what their customers' needs were going to be was unbelievably valuable to them through the crisis. Meaning, having that open dialogue and being transparent about what you can and can't do with them, what you are intending to buy, what you're not intending to buy from them, helps them with their own business management and their credit availability as they're talking to strategic investors on their side who are going to help them with liquidity through the crisis.
Completely agree, James. So just one, quick thing is that financial health, as James mentioned, it really is foundational. If the supplier is gone, nothing else matters, right? That's kind of we live by and breathe that mantra. The way we look at it is that, you really want your supplier risk scoring or supplier KPIs to all be in a central kind of command and control type place. And here's why. There are many things that can sometimes be leading indicators, such as things like on-time delivery. To take a quick example, we've been working with some of our customers to build a machine learning predictive model around how on-time delivery is affected during global events. And one of the things we found is a correlation between the supplier's on-time delivery performance and their financial health. So we're exploring that further to, explore the leading indicator here. But there are different types of supplier KPIs, metrics, and risk indices that, when looked at together for a given supplier, such as their locations globally, what type of risks are they exposed to within those locations, again, combining that with the monitoring program, understanding what are the things that are going on in those regions, looking at the suppliers' different types of assessments of the supplier, like their quality, compliance, sustainability, capacity, etc. And then, other capabilities where the supplier may have weaker capabilities, such as perhaps cybersecurity, safety, physical security, etc. All of those help build a profile of the supplier. Where are they taking some shortcuts? Where are they not very robust? Because all of those combined can paint a picture about what might be going on in the background. So as I said, ideal scenario, you want the financial health rating and the score, but there are many different ways in which to build a supplier picture using data that you may have or that you can get from different sources or collect from the supplier themselves through an ongoing supplier assessment process. At the end of the day, if you go to the next slide, the idea is to start looking at the supplier, the trend of the supplier score over time, identifying which score is the weakest. How does this score compare against other companies within that industry that you use? And then identifying where the supplier is ranked and which indices they are strongest on or weakest on. I think the idea we're promoting here is that there's a lot of information that's out there. A lot of times companies have one tool for capacity, one other tool for sustainability, some other tool for business continuity. They don't do monitoring at all, or they may be doing it in yet another tool. The idea here is when you bring all this supplier data and intelligence centrally in a single place and bolster it with third-party intelligence that comes from experts like RapidRatings for financial health, along with other, experts who may be in other areas of supplier ranking and scorecarding. But the idea is bring it all in a single place so that when you now look at a full picture of the supplier, things might pop out that in an isolated way for just looking at CSR, sustainability, or quality in different tools and different places by different people may not be immediately obvious. And then the idea is to watch the trend and then the comparison with other suppliers similar in that industry. James, anything to add on this one?
No, I totally agree.
The next topic, I think we covered this before. Just want to re-emphasize that a lot of companies right now and just in general, we focus extensively on our direct suppliers, right? Our entire focus is always, I have direct relationships with my high spend suppliers, and we often don't take the time to map the global supply chain, really understand who are the suppliers. So one of the things we do at Redlink is we help companies. We call ourselves, we're the mapping company of the world, because we help companies go collect supply chain mapping data, the confidential information that the supplier knows. Suppliers can provide and tell you who are their suppliers, which global sites do they have, etc. And what you're seeing on this visualization is the green dots. The bright green dots are your direct suppliers, and the blue dots are their suppliers, and the teal dots are suppliers. So the idea here is to highlight, and if you see a red circle around it, then what that represents is that more than 10 of your direct suppliers are using a second tier supplier that is the single point of failure. So you may have these types of second tier failure points in your supply chain where 10 or 20 or 30 of your direct suppliers are all relying on that same second tier source. And without supply chain mapping in combination with a FHR type financial health rating, you may be very focused on your tier one, not realizing that there's a single point of failure like this in your second tier supply chain. So really want to encourage mapping and in combination with financial health as a really good way to really understand the true risk that is out there in your supply chain. James, anything to add on that one?
Just that I would say that sub-tier visibility has been one of the most prevalent trends that we've seen over the last couple of years, increasing in our clients and wanting to get deeper, into tiers 2 and tiers 3, which can't be done unless they're mapped well. So totally agree. It's critical, and it's been increasing in importance for companies well before the current crisis, and only more important because of the crisis.
Yeah, so I think that brings us to the last topic, which is, as we look at the supply chain now, and going forward, we're hearing a lot in the news right now about, companies looking to increase inventory or second source or have 2 sites and things like that. The way we look at it at Resilinc is that, and I certainly have worked in procurement for many years in the high-tech industry, and we always have a very high reliance in certain industries on a core group of single source suppliers that are very difficult to find or qualify another source for various reasons. You may not have enough demand to justify 2 sources. At the end of the day, the second source must be interested in your business. If you don't have sufficient volumes or revenue, they may not want you to qualify them, right? Because and then other times you are building something customized or semi-custom for your products, so the second source is not available. And in some cases, the supplier just outright has the patent or the technology. And so for example, in the life science pharma industries, you may be reliant on suppliers that you've gone through an FDA or other approval process, and getting that reapproved with someone else might take you 2 years. So what we're showing here is that it may not always be possible to have 2 sources. So what do companies do in that case? When resilience and risk management is so critical in today's environment, what we're talking about here is a good, solid, comprehensive monitoring, risk scoring, mapping program can help you manage your single source dependencies. When you segment your suppliers, again, by revenue impact, and say, who are your suppliers that are highest impact to your business, where you may have a sole source or single source type dependency with them? Those are your red suppliers. Make sure you're monitoring. Make sure you're naming the supplier in your contingent business interruption insurance policy. If it's possible, if you have enough volume, sure, look at second sourcing and developing another source. If you really have the revenue impact to your business, then that always, see, if you go to your manager and say, hey, I want to, we spend 300,000 with this company and I want to spend 500,000 with second source or develop another source for this material, the leadership will hesitate. But if you tell them, well, we spend 500,000, but this supplier is used on a product that is $4 billion in revenue impact, and they are a single source for us, and I want to now spend 500,000 to qualify another site or get another source. Okay, you have their attention now because you've created the business case for mitigation. So having that revenue impact is really important again. But again, as you can see, monitoring your supplier, news about your supplier, absolutely critical. And having a mapping program, you don't have to go down to part level or sub-tier level in all cases, but at least identify the sub-tier network that is dependent, that you're dependent on, so that at least when something happens somewhere in the world, you're forced to the table to work with that supplier to resolve the problem. At the end of the day, the message we want to provide and the guidance that we want to give is that you don't have to invest in hundreds of millions of dollars in additional inventory or spend millions of dollars qualifying second sources on everything. You can have a resilient supply chain with data and a proper investment in resiliency best practices, which is far greater ROI. The ROI on that is hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a no-brainer in today's environment. James, I think that was it. Perhaps if you have any final comments on that topic.
Well, I think that it probably wraps into our parting thoughts, really, which if I were to categorize all of this in one way, I would say that it is about data management, data integrity, and cleanliness, and operationalizing the results that come from analyzing that data. So the common comments that we get from our clients are, many of them are listed here, but they really revolve around being able to increase the scope of risk management while at the same time being able to go deeper in the analysis than one has gone before, and being able to have workflows built to operationalize those insights, and recognizing that they can be tied back to very discernible returns on investment, such as inventory, as Bindi has just mentioned. And whether that's by reducing the amount of extra inventory that's being held, or whether that's by reducing the number of financially unhealthy suppliers that have increased incidence of delivering faulty product or delivering late, causing over inventory as a strategy. All of these are elements to having a better risk management system and being able to create a more resilient supply chain because of it. I know we've got a few minutes left for questions, and I'd like to make sure that we leave a few for that. If anyone has questions, you can submit them through the system, and maybe I can turn it back over to Vipin if any questions have come in while we've been talking.
Thank you, James. Yeah, we actually did have a few questions come in. The first question, Bindia, this goes to your conversation on supply chain mapping. Since we have an indirect relationship with these sub-tier suppliers, how can we gather this information for the supply chain mapping without violating proprietary agreements?
Yeah, so this is, the way you do it is obviously to have a supply chain mapping program in place. What we typically see is that the best practice, and Resilinc's been mapping the global supply chain in many industries since 2010. So we've mapped down 3 tiers, 4 tiers deep. The way we do it is we start with the first tier supplier, identify who the second tier suppliers are, what sites are they using for those suppliers, what categories are purchase from those. And then in some cases, we see that the first tier supplier will go down and provide a lot more detail down to product, BOM, and part level for the parts that the company buys from that first tier supplier. And then for the critical suppliers that are tier 2, we do certainly go out directly to the tier 2 on behalf of the end client. And again, we don't have to get the part and BOM level detail. All we're getting from the second tier supplier is identifying their global factory locations and what are the categories that they manufacture there. And that's it. So it does not violate a confidentiality. All we're asking is footprint mapping from the second tier, so that, and let me tell you how customers use this, because I think a lot of times people worry about the second tier, that they worry that the customer will somehow misuse it. In all of the years of our mapping, 10 years of supply chain mapping now, we don't see this behavior. What we do is we are monitoring global sites and locations and suppliers, and we send an early warning to companies saying that, hey, this event has just happened, there's a flood here, or there's a profit warning there, and here are the suppliers who are in that region or who may be affected, and these are the tier 1 suppliers that use these tier 2 supplier sites or vendors. And this gives the customer almost like it's a first line of defense, so that rather than being caught off guard when that results in a PO delivery 6 weeks or 7 weeks later, the customer has that information outside of lead time, which is really the time when you can work collaboratively to find a solution. By the time the customer places an order and the supplier says, oh, I can't deliver it at the date you requested, it's too late. Now you can't really switch sites, get inventory from someone else, etc. Right? So the way customers are really using the information is to manage their supply continuity. They're not using this information to design someone out. And it comes with trust, the transparency, not being punished, like I said before, builds greater trust and partnership. And our customers also help the supplier succeed, right? So at the end of the day, everybody wins.
And Vipin, I can add to that for financial data, which is of course one of the most sensitive items for any private company, the collaboration is a critical part, whether you're talking about a tier 1 or a tier 2. And it's we are able to get disclosure from private companies, again, regardless of what tier, because they recognize and we're explaining to them that there is a commercial value to the transparency, and that the data is not being used against them, and that it is being maintained in a confidential manner, all of which are the most critical concerns that they have. Particularly in this time, private companies need to work collaboratively with their customers, and they recognize that their customers want, or generally want, to work collaboratively with them. So my recommendation for supply chain risk managers and third-party risk managers is, one silver lining to this crisis is there is no better time to establish a pattern of disclosure and benefit for both sides in that disclosure than there is right now, because everybody fully understands that there is a need for strengthening in the customer-supplier relationship. When it comes to disclosure in the sub-tiers, it is critical that the tier 1 partner be involved. And we see this many times where a client of ours will work with a tier 1 supplier, and we, on their behalf, will speak to a tier 2 or even a tier 3. In which case, generally the disclosure is being made and the analytics are being provided both levels above, which creates for a deeper bond and a deeper relationship when there's more transparency and more visibility. So again, it comes back to the same theme that the collaborative nature is critical to disclosure, and disclosure can be critical to making better and more sustained business decisions where both sides benefit.
Thanks, James. Another question that we had come in were around the trends that we're seeing in supplier pay solutions. Are we seeing any trends there?
Oh, I'm happy to start, Bindia. We're certainly seeing it. As I said before, one of the or some of the most critical questions that a private company has when we're rating them is what does my rating look like, and can I use it for anything else? And so we've actually created a network, the Financial Health Rating FHR network, that allows for companies to join, and in joining be able to permission where their ratings go and who gets it. And many of them are using it to submit to every RFP that they respond to in the course of a year. But I do think there is a trend towards the sharing of payment and the sharing of cost in risk management. And enterprise clients are doing a mix of budgeting dollars for the most critical and as broad a reach as they can into the longer tail of more transactional suppliers, and then wanting to create incentives and means for the rest of the suppliers to be able to join and get visibility in both directions as well. So we're certainly seeing it more, and we're providing a means for that as well in our solution.
Bindia, did you have any comments on that particular question?
Yeah, we have also seen there's interest in this, particularly because, as supply chain mapping becomes more important, and many companies are looking to kind of have a mapping program without it creating a huge burden on budget or resources. And at the end of the day, with a solution like Resilink, companies recognize that they cannot be resilient in isolation. They're part of a supply chain network, and they can invest huge amounts of money, but if their suppliers are not paying attention to their suppliers and their global, and they're not monitoring their supply chain, then they're leaving a whole bunch of things to chance. And so by what we're looking at in this space is we are offering companies the ability to do mapping and give suppliers our monitoring capabilities so that the supplier can upload their global sites and sub-tier locations into Resilink and subscribe to our monitoring service, as well as similar to FHR, Resilink has the resiliency score, or the R score, which a supplier can similarly use in RFPs and things like that. So along with the monitoring and the R score, which suppliers gain as with benchmarking and things like that, they get value back. This value helps the supplier be more aware of global disruptions, monitor their sites, use our mobile app, etc. And it creates a shared cost, but shared value more importantly. A shared value model where the customer gets the mapping, the visibility, and the collaboration platform, and the supplier gains a monitoring program.
Thanks, Bindia. I just had, so we're actually up on time in terms of questions. We did have a few other questions come in that we'll answer offline. I want to thank James and Bindia for doing this recording, and a special thanks to all of you who have joined. You'll receive a recorded version of this session within 48 hours. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to me at vipin.shri@rapidratings.com or info@rapidratings.com, and I can connect you with Bindia and the Resilink team as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.